Ask a historian to name the worst year in human history, and most reach for the obvious. The year a great war began, a city burned, a plague arrived. They are all wrong. The single worst year to be alive, measured in failed harvests, mass starvation, whole civilizations brought to their knees, wasn't decided by any army, emperor, or battle. It was decided by the sky. And in the year 536, the sky went dark. You know how this period is usually told. The Roman world is fading. Barbarian kingdoms rise in the west. Justinian sits in Constantinople dreaming of reconquest. The slow twilight of antiquity, a story of politics, borders, and kings, a tidy story. And it leaves out the most important character of all, because something happened in 536 that no chronicler could explain and no king could fight. Something that made people across 3 continents look up at the same impossible sky and feel the world itself was ending. Start with a sentence written by a man who was actually there. His name was Procopius, a Byzantine historian, no stranger to war and disaster. And in 536 he wrote something that reads less like history than prophecy. The sun, he said, gave its light without brightness, like the moon, for the entire year, as if it were in continual eclipse. A full year, not an afternoon, not a storm, a whole year of a dimmed, powerless sun. And Procopius was not alone. Stop and picture what that actually means. You wake up. The sun rises, but it's wrong. Pale, cold. You can stare straight at it, a dull silver disk in a sky that never quite becomes day. The warmth is gone. Now imagine it doesn't end next week or next month, but lasts through spring, through summer, into the next year. Not a single dark day, but a dimmed world, stretching all the way around the globe. And the terrifying thing is how many people recorded it, in places that had never heard of each other. In the Mediterranean, a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus described a sun of strange blue color, casting no shadows at noon. Far to the east, Chinese chronicles recorded a year when yellow dust rained down like snow, stars dimmed, and summer brought frost. Different empires, different languages, the same impossible sky. Whatever happened in 536 did not happen to one nation. It happened to the world. Now follow what a dimmed sun does to a planet that lives and dies by the harvest. Choke the sun, and you choke the food. So in the summer of 536, the warmth simply did not come. In the heart of the growing season, snow fell and frost killed the crops. The chronicles speak of a year without a summer, and to people who had known nothing but the seasons, that was not weather. It was the order of the world breaking. And where the harvest fails, hunger is never far behind. Granaries that should have been filling stood empty. The price of what little food remained climbed beyond reach. From Ireland to the Middle East, the records grow grim. Irish annals from these years simply note, a failure of bread. 3 words. But to a farming people, an apocalypse. This is the quiet horror of 536. No invader sacked these fields. No army burned these barns. The enemy was the absence of light. Sit with how strange this is. We are trained to imagine catastrophe as something loud. Swords, fire, the thunder of collapsing walls. The villain is always human, always nameable. But the worst catastrophe in recorded history made no sound at all. No face, no banner, no demands. Just a veil drawn across the sun, and the people living through it had no way to understand it. They could only watch the light fail, the crops die, and wonder what they had done to make the heavens turn away. For nearly 1,500 years, that was where the story stopped. The chronicles described a dimmed sun and a year without summer, then fell silent on the cause. Medieval readers assumed divine punishment. Later historians, lacking any mechanism, dismissed it as the exaggerations of a superstitious age. But the witnesses kept agreeing, across continents and languages. And in our own time, science finally found a way to ask the ice and the trees what really happened. Start with the trees. Every year a tree lives, it lays down a ring. A warm year makes a wide ring. A cold, starved, sunless year makes a ring so thin it can barely be seen. So scientists gathered ancient timbers from across the northern hemisphere and read them like a diary written in wood. And around 536, the diary screams. The rings shrink to almost nothing. A sudden, brutal, hemisphere-wide collapse in summer warmth, exactly when the chronicles said the sun had failed. Then there is the ice. Deep in the glaciers of Greenland and the Alps, every snowfall freezes layer on layer, trapping a record of the air at the moment it fell. In the ice formed right around 536, scientists found it. A sharp spike of volcanic ash and sulfur slammed into the frozen record. The trees said the sun was choked. The ice said what choked it. Somewhere on Earth, a volcano had erupted with such violence it punched a wound into the upper atmosphere. Here's the mechanism the ancients could feel but never name. When a great volcano erupts, it hurls millions of tons of sulfur into the stratosphere, far above the rain that would wash it down. Up there, that sulfur forms a fine haze that spreads on the high winds until it wraps the entire planet. And it does one simple, devastating thing. It reflects sunlight back into space before it reaches the ground. A veil over the sun, exactly what Procopius watched and never understood. And now the story gets worse than even the ancients knew, because the ice doesn't show one eruption, it shows a cluster. A first colossal blast around 536, then another around 540, and possibly a third soon after. The latest research points toward a massive eruption in the far north, likely Iceland, as the trigger of the 536 darkness. And a second giant eruption struck before the world could recover. Not a single blow, but a planet hit again and again, plunged into the coldest decade in thousands of years. Let that scale settle on you. This was not a bad season. It was the beginning of what scientists now call the late antique Little Ice Age, a dramatic cooling that gripped the northern hemisphere for well over a century. Summers turned bitter. Growing seasons shortened. Glaciers crept forward. The reliable rhythm of warm years that fed entire civilizations simply broke. For people who measured wealth in grain, a decade of cold was a slow-motion catastrophe with no end in sight. Now hold a starving, frozen, frightened world in your mind, and understand it was about to be hit by something far deadlier than cold. Famine does more than kill. It weakens. Bodies stripped of food lose their defenses. People crowd into cities chasing bread. Trade routes carry the desperate, and whatever travels with them. So when the next disaster came, it found a population already thinned, already broken, already primed. The darkness had set the stage. A few years later, the curtain rose on the deadliest act of all. In the year 541 it arrived, in the Egyptian port of Pelusium, on the edge of the Roman world. It was bubonic plague. the same horror that would one day be called the Black Death, striking 800 years earlier. It moved along the grain ships and trade roads into the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. By 542, it reached Constantinople itself, the richest, most crowded city in the Mediterranean. And there the dying began on a scale no one had ever recorded. Procopius was there again, and what he describes is almost beyond belief. At its peak, he claims, the plague killed thousands in the city every single day. The dead came faster than the living could bury them. Bodies were stacked in the towers of the city walls, then loaded onto ships and set adrift. Daily life stopped. The markets fell silent, the streets emptied. The Emperor Justinian himself caught the disease and barely survived. A city that had ruled an empire was reduced to counting its corpses. And it did not stop at the city walls. The plague spread across the Eastern Empire and beyond, returning in wave after wave for 200 years. The death toll is still debated, but the chronicles and many historians point to one shattering estimate. Perhaps a third of the Eastern Roman Empire's population gone. In some regions, higher still, 1 in 3. Whole villages erased, fields with no one to harvest them. An empire's lifeblood, its soldiers, its taxpayers, drained away in a single lifetime. Now remember what Justinian had been trying to do. He had launched the great project of his age, to reconquer the lost western half of the Roman Empire. His armies had retaken Africa and were fighting through Italy. Then the sky darkened, the harvests failed, and the plague swept away the very people who paid for the armies and filled their ranks. The reconquest bled out, the vision of one restored Roman world dying not on a battlefield, but in the empty fields and silent cities left by disease. Step back far enough, and 536 stops being a year and becomes a hinge. On one side lies the classical world, the long shadow of Rome, still reaching for its old glory. On the other, something new, poorer, colder, more fractured. The early Middle Ages. Historians still debate how much weight to place on those eruptions. But the timing is impossible to ignore. The dimming sun, the famine, the plague, all in a single brutal generation. The age of antiquity did not simply fade, it was pushed. So why does a dark year 15 centuries ago still matter? Because it shatters the story we like to tell, that history is driven by human hands, kings, wars, ambition. We always hunt for someone to blame, but 536 had no villain, no army to defeat, no tyrant to overthrow. Just a planet that grew cold, and millions caught beneath a sky they could not fight. The greatest catastrophe in recorded history wasn't a war we lost. It was a reminder of how thin the line really is between a civilization and a single year without a summer. For 1,500 years, the chronicles whispered about a dimmed sun and a year without a summer, and almost no one believed them. The trees and the ice proved them right. So here's my question. We spend our histories blaming emperors and armies. But how many of history's great turning points were decided not by people but by the sky, the soil, and the silent forces beneath our feet? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe. Because at Empire Archives, we don't just retell the famous battles. We dig up the forgotten catastrophes that bent the course of history.